The cold air of Wisconsin cut sharply on the morning of January 18, 1943, as the troop train screeched to a halt at Camp McCoy. Steam hissed from the engine, curling into the sky and momentarily veiling the scene through the swirling mist. The first Japanese prisoners of war stepped down, their uniforms worn thin from months of combat and captivity. Their eyes scanned the horizon, bracing for humiliation, punishment, perhaps even starvation. Instead, they saw a line of white-coated figures waiting with clipboards, stethoscopes glinting, and trays of medical instruments resting on trestle tables. It was not barbed wire they noticed first, but the smell of antiseptic. The men froze. Many had been told, as they crossed the Pacific under armed guard, that America was barbaric, that capture meant torture. Yet here stood doctors, nurses, and orderlies, their boots crunching in the snow, preparing for what looked like an inspection, but one unlike any they had imagined. Behind the medical staff rose a cluster of barracks, their windows lit by the pale sun. A large canvas tent had been erected nearby, with red crosses painted boldly on its sides. A low murmur passed through the prisoners. Were these crosses camouflage for execution chambers, or a grotesque display of mockery? Among them was Seaman First Class Hiroshi Takeda, barely 21, clutching the collar of his coat, in a notebook he kept hidden in his sleeve. He later scrawled, "I thought the needles would be poison." The guards looked away as if to hide the shame of what was about to happen. My heart raced as though I had already died. This private confession, captured in faded pencil, would survive decades in an archive. The faint handwriting trembling with the fear of that first day. Camp McCoy, like more than 500 facilities across the United States, was part of a vast logistical network. Between 1942 and 1945, the War Department oversaw nearly 425,000 Axis prisoners, including about 5,000 Japanese. They were scattered from Texas to Wisconsin, from Louisiana to California. The system required precision. Every prisoner registered, fed, and evaluated. Medical operations were not charity, but necessity epidemics inside camps could threaten American soldiers and civilians alike. Statistics tell the story bluntly. In 1943 alone, U.S. Army medical staff administered more than 10 million vaccinations to prisoners and recruits combined. A campaign of industrial medicine as relentless as factory assembly lines. The first shocking contrast was visible in the small acts. As the prisoners shuffled forward, each was given a paper tag around his neck, bearing his number. Then came the order: remove tunics, roll up sleeves. The January wind bit at their skin. Some shivered with cold, others with dread. And yet, the Americans moved with calm efficiency, dipping cotton in alcohol, swabbing arms, speaking in low English phrases that most prisoners could not understand. The rhythm of clinking syringes and boots on snow created a soundscape both alien and unforgettable for the Americans. This was routine for the prisoners. It was the beginning of a psychological war, unlike the one they had prepared for. As the line crept forward, the contradiction sharpened enemies, captured and defeated, being medically examined rather than left to rot. Each man felt the weight of uncertainty, balanced between humiliation and survival. And so the arrival ended not with beatings or executions, but with the sting of alcohol on bare skin, the cold gleam of steel, and the first puncture of a needle, a symbol not of death, but of something far stranger, life preserved by the hands of those they had sworn to destroy. The barracks still smelled of fresh-cut pine when the prisoners were ordered into lines once more. It was February 3rd, 1943, only 2 weeks after their arrival at Camp McCoy. When the medical staff announced the beginning of full immunizations, snow fell heavily outside, muffling the clang of mess hall trays and the distant whistle of a locomotive. Inside the long wooden hall, benches had been moved aside to form an assembly space. Lantern light reflected on stainless steel trays filled with syringes, each needle gleaming as though sharpened for punishment for many of the Japanese POWs. The sight alone was enough to turn their stomachs. The American Army had scheduled vaccinations against smallpox, typhoid, and diphtheria diseases that had ravaged armies in previous wars. Army records show that by mid-1943, over 94% of Axis prisoners in the United States had been immunized. A figure that astonished public health officials. For the Americans, it was efficiency, prevention, protection for the prisoners. It was unfathomable. The very idea that the enemy would keep them alive, protect them from invisible killers, clashed violently with years of indoctrination that promised honor only in death. Private First Class Masao Yamada, who had served in the Solomon Islands, later recalled in a diary smuggled home. The needle pierced the skin, and I thought my blood would darken, that poison would spread. I waited for dizziness, for the fall, but instead, the American doctor patted my arm and said words I could not understand. The man even smiled. For Yamada, the greater shock was not the injection, but the absence of cruelty. He wrote that silence spread down the line, broken only by the squeak of boots and the clatter of metal trays. The gossip inside the barracks that night was fevered. Some swore they had seen prisoners faint and be carried to cots, never to return. Others whispered that the sugar cubes distributed afterwards soaked with quinine or vitamins were a trick to soften resistance. A slow poison disguised as kindness. A few even claimed that Americans were experimenting on their bodies, using them as test animals. Rumors flickered like candlelight, fueling suspicion. Yet alongside fear came the first cracks of doubt. If the enemy wished them dead, why not simply let them freeze, starve, or bleed? Why expend so much medicine, glass, and labor? The camp physicians, many trained in civilian hospitals before the war, logged the injections with precision. Each prisoner's number was matched to dosage records, stored in boxes alongside medical charts. On one page, still preserved today, a doctor scrawled, "Batch 1467 men, no complications." Such cold efficiency stood in stark contrast to the prisoners' inner turmoil. It was bureaucracy colliding with ideology, science colliding with myth. When the day ended, the barracks were strangely quiet. The smell of iodine lingered on their sleeves, and the faint sting of puncture wounds pulsed with every movement. In the dim light, some men rubbed their arms as though erasing shame. Others sat with eyes wide open, waiting for the imagined poison to spread. The contradiction was too vast to resolve in a single day, leaving only an uneasy silence, a silence heavy with the weight of survival. The infirmary at Camp McCoy was a long, low building of whitewashed timber, its windows steaming against the winter chill. By March 1943, it had already seen a steady stream of Japanese prisoners carried in on stretchers or guided by guards with quiet urgency. Some were gaunt from malaria contracted in the Pacific. Others bore festering wounds that had been untreated during their weeks of transport. For the first time, enemy hands would hold knives above their bodies not to kill, but to cut and save. One morning, Seaman Hiroshi Takeda was among the first to witness what he later described in a smuggled letter as a theater of contradiction. A fellow prisoner, Petty Officer Kenji Morimoto, had shrapnel lodged deep in his thigh, infection spreading up to his hip. The smell of pus clung to him, and each step left him trembling. Japanese command had once told their men that capture meant dishonor, that Americans would laugh while letting them rot. Yet here, under the harsh light of two suspended bulbs, an American surgeon named Captain William Harris prepared a sterile field, humming softly as he arranged clamps and scalpels. Statistics preserved in U.S. Army Medical Department records reveal that between 1943 and 1945, over 1,200 surgical procedures were performed on Japanese POWs in camps across the Midwest alone. Appendectomies, amputations, hernia repairs, and debridements were carried out with the same rigor given to American soldiers. Survival rates exceeded 92%, a number almost unthinkable for men who had expected nothing but cruelty. During Morimoto's operation, Harris worked in silence but with steady confidence. A nurse, Private Helen Brooks, barely 22, passed instruments with practiced speed. Prisoners detailed to clean linen stood in the doorway, their eyes wide. The scalpel cut swiftly. The shrapnel, dark and jagged, was lifted into a steel dish with a faint metallic clink. Morimoto groaned under chloroform, but his breathing steadied. Harris stitched the wound closed, wiping his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. When it was over, the surgeon muttered only. Next, in the barracks that night, rumors swirled again. Some whispered that Morimoto had lost his leg, others that he had died under the knife, when he was carried back days later, limping but alive. The whispers turned to stunned silence. He showed the line of stitches, each knot gleaming with ointment. "The enemy saved me," he said softly in Japanese, words that carried the weight of betrayal and relief in equal measure. Other cases followed. A sailor with gangrene had his leg amputated above the knee. He survived, though he later wept at night. Ashamed to return home maimed, a malnourished conscript underwent an appendectomy that prevented certain death. American doctors documented each case, attaching photographs and reports for the War Department. For them, it was policy. For the prisoners, it was dissonance so sharp it felt like madness. Not all adjusted easily. Some refused surgery, demanding to be left alone. A few spat at nurses, or turned their faces away in stubborn silence. But the evidence of survival was undeniable. Scars became symbols lines etched across skin that testified to a world in which enemies acted like protectors. For the first time, the prisoners began to wonder if what they had been told about the Americans about cruelty, savagery, and indifference had been a lie all along. The infirmary lights flickered at night, casting long shadows through frosted windows. Inside, the sound of scissors, gauze, and whispered English phrases marked the transformation of enemies into reluctant patients, and beyond those walls. The silence of the camp grew heavier, filled with questions that no one dared speak aloud. By April 1943, the barracks at Camp McCoy had become more than a place to sleep. They were pressure cookers of rumor, suspicion, and reluctant gratitude. Wooden bunks stacked 3 high smelled of sweat and pine. Steam from tin mugs of weak coffee curled upward, mingling with the smoke of contraband cigarettes. After lights out, whispers traveled along the narrow aisles, as powerful as any order from a commanding officer. One evening, Seaman First Class Hiroshi Takeda sat hunched over his diary, its pages shielded by the dim glow of a contraband candle stub. He wrote, "They cut Morimoto open, and yet he breathes still. I cannot believe my own eyes. The scar is real, stitched like rope, not the mark of death but of survival. Some say the Americans practiced sorcery with their knives." These words, raw with disbelief, captured the tension spreading across the camp. Small details became gossip. A prisoner swore he had overheard an American nurse humming a lullaby in English while bandaging a sailor's hand. Another described being handed sugar cubes after a vaccination, a gesture that sparked heated debate. Was it kindness or mockery? And when a guard was seen sipping coffee side by side with a prisoner during a work detail, the barracks erupted in furious arguments. Such images unsettled men trained to believe the enemy was subhuman. Not all conversations were whispered. Fistfights broke out over ideology. In one recorded incident, Sergeant Shunji Nakamura accused a fellow prisoner of being poisoned by American smiles. Later that night, Nakamura himself was heard weeping quietly, his sobs muffled by the thin mattress. Survival had begun to blur the boundaries of loyalty and betrayal. Statistics added to the confusion. By mid-1943, official camp records showed that over 85% of Japanese prisoners at McCoy had undergone at least one medical treatment, from vaccinations to minor operations. This was far beyond what many had received in their own units during the war. The numbers whispered their own story, enemies investing resources in survival, not death. Everyday life fed the paradox. A farmer's daughter once passed the wire fence with a basket of apples, tossing a few toward the prisoners during work detail. Laughter erupted, brief and almost shameful, that same night. The barracks fell silent when someone muttered, "If they were truly demons, would they feed us fruit?" It was not a question anyone wanted to answer aloud. Takeda later recorded another moment in Japan. The emperor is the sun. Here, the Americans are strange stars, cold but illuminating. I fear to look too long, lest I forget which sky I belong to. His words capture the fracture of identity that spread quietly among men who had once marched shouting the same slogans. By the summer of 1943, the barracks had become theaters of tension. Every cough, every scar, every smile from across the wire carried hidden meaning. The silence of the bunks was no longer the silence of loyalty, but the silence of men staring at contradictions too large to resolve. And in that silence, the foundations of belief began to crack. By the autumn of 1943, the Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy no longer looked like the men who had first stumbled off the train. Their uniforms had been replaced by denim work clothes, their bodies thicker from steady rations, their arms marked with faint vaccination scars. but inside the barracks. A deeper transformation was underway, a psychological fracture that no guard could fully control. The contradictions pressed harder with every passing week. Men who had once sworn to die for the emperor now found themselves waking each morning to oatmeal and coffee, to nurses who took their fevers seriously, to surgeons who stitched their wounds without contempt. For some, this was unbearable. "We are not soldiers anymore," one prisoner muttered bitterly after receiving treatment for pneumonia. "We are children being fattened by the enemy." His words stung, yet few disagreed aloud. At the center of this storm stood Sergeant Shinji Nakamura, a strict nationalist. He led late-night lectures urging loyalty to the emperor, pacing the barracks with clenched fists. But even Nakamura could not ignore the scar that ran across his own chest, the result of a hernia surgery performed by Captain William Harris. The American surgeon, in quieter moments, men caught him pressing his hand against the stitches, his eyes clouded with unease. His very body had become evidence of a contradiction he could not silence. Others drifted in the opposite direction. Private Masao Yamada, once haunted by the sting of the first injection, began writing fragments of relief in his diary. "I feel the fever less each week. The nurse pats my shoulder. I cannot hate her smile. What does that make me?" These confessions, smuggled past censors or whispered to bunkmates, spread a dangerous idea, perhaps survival, not sacrifice, was the true path. Statistics bore out the shifting ground across the United States. By the end of 1943, over 3,500 Japanese POWs had undergone medical treatment of some form. The survival rate exceeded 90%, an astonishing figure compared with the battlefield, where infection and neglect claimed thousands. Numbers became another weapon against ideology. How could cruelty and mercy exist side by side, stitched into the same flesh? Even small moments cut deep. During a work detail on a Wisconsin farm, prisoners were startled to see a Black American laborer working shoulder to shoulder with white farmers, his laughter ringing across the field. One prisoner whispered, "In Japan, he would not be allowed to eat with us. Yet here, they share bread." The observation hung heavy in the air. Was the enemy not only powerful, but also strangely open, in ways they had never imagined? By winter, arguments split the camp. Some swore their duty was to resist even kindness, to spit it out like poison. Others quietly admitted they slept more easily. Their fevers gone, their bodies repaired. The barracks became a battlefield of conscience. Each scar a reminder of survival, each rumor a test of loyalty. Viewers, I must ask you directly, if you were in their place, saved by the hands of your enemy, stitched and fed by those you were taught to despise, would you cling to the old faith, or would you begin to doubt? Share your thoughts below. By early 1944, the contradictions had begun spilling beyond the barracks and into letters home. Prisoners, once terrified of writing anything that could be censored, now faced the torment of describing their survival. Each envelope passed through the hands of American officers, red stamps blotting out sensitive words, yet even under censorship, fragments of confession leaked through. Private Masao Yamada, the sailor once trembling at the sight of needles, wrote to his younger brother in Osaka, "My fever is gone. The Americans gave me medicine. I still live. Do not think of me as weak. Think of me as fortunate." The lines were shaky, as though his hand hesitated over each character, but the sentiment was unmistakable. His brother would later describe the letter as a wound reopened, proof that survival could carry as much shame as death. Other notes hinted at a slow thaw. One prisoner described an American nurse tying back her hair before changing his bandages, a gesture so mundane it haunted him for nights. Another spoke of a guard who shared half a sandwich during a work shift, bread and cheese eaten in silence by the wire fence. Such details carried the weight of gossip repeated, embellished, and passed along like contraband. Camp records reveal that by 1944, Japanese POWs had mailed more than 200,000 letters through official channels, though censored. These letters offered glimpses of a world their families could scarcely imagine. The War Department monitored them closely, fearing propaganda leaks. But the subtext was undeniable. Men once ready to die for the emperor were now writing about surviving through American kindness. For Tokyo, these words would have been poison for the prisoners. They were confessions of a secret truth. The impact rippled through the camp. Sergeant Nakamura, the once fiery nationalist, grew quieter. His nightly lectures became rare. Prisoners whispered that he had received a letter from his wife, describing their child dying of dysentery in Hiroshima. "If Americans saved my boy as they saved me," he was heard muttering, "what loyalty would I owe then?" His words, half-spoken in exhaustion, spread quickly, unsettling those who still clung to old certainties. By summer, the barracks were filled with unanswerable questions. One prisoner argued, "If we survive here, is it mercy or is it humiliation?" Another countered, "If they wanted humiliation, they would have left us to die. They give us scars, not graves." These debates echoed long into the night, until the barracks became less a prison than a theater of conscience. Audience, I ask you now, what would you write if you were in their shoes? Would you tell your family of survival bought with the enemy's hands, or would you hide it in silence? Comment below. Your perspective matters in remembering how fragile conviction can become. By the spring of 1946, the war was long over, yet the camps still echoed with footsteps, orders, and the hiss of steam from departing trains. At Camp McCoy, the Japanese prisoners lined up once more, not for vaccinations, not for surgery, but for the final journey home. Snow was melting on the platform, puddles reflecting the red and white insignia of the American transport trains. Each man carried a small bag, the sum of years spent behind wire, and many carried something else that could not be packed away: scars. Seaman First Class Hiroshi Takeda rubbed the faint vaccination mark on his upper arm as he waited to board. To anyone else, it was a small bump, barely visible. To him, it was proof that his body had been spared by American needles. He glanced at Petty Officer Morimoto, limping but alive, his stitched thigh a permanent reminder of an operation that defied everything they had been taught. Behind them, Sergeant Nakamura walked in silence, one hand pressed to his chest as if still feeling the phantom pull of stitches beneath his shirt. The train whistle cut the air, long and mournful. Numbers tell part of the story. By the time the last Japanese POWs left American soil in 1946, more than 4 of 500 had passed through camps across the Midwest. Thousands had been vaccinated, hundreds operated upon, dozens saved from certain death. U.S. Army medical reports showed survival rates above 90% for all major treatments, figures that would have astonished families back in Japan, where shortages of medicine left civilians dying of infections. For the prisoners, those statistics lived in flesh and bone, etched into their arms, legs, and torsos. The mood on the platform was not one of triumph, but of quiet tension. Some men pulled their sleeves down to hide the scars, unwilling to show proof of survival through enemy hands. Others touched them openly, as if to carry home a secret testimony. For some, the scars were shame, evidence of dependency, weakness, humiliation. For others, they were life itself, stubborn proof that even in captivity, survival mattered more than ideology. A diary found decades later in Tokyo carried a single, haunting line. "They gave me back my body, but I do not know what to do with it." Such confessions captured the ambiguity that rode the train cars across the continent, over rivers and fields, toward the ships that would return them to Japan. The engines roared, steam swallowing the figures as the train began to move. Farmers stood silently by the fence. Guards raised their hands in brief, almost human gestures of farewell. The prisoners looked out through fogged windows, watching Wisconsin recede, the land where their survival had been rewritten. What they carried back was not just scars of flesh, but scars of the mind, the unshakable memory that their enemies had preserved their lives when death had seemed certain. When the last trains pulled away and the barracks of Camp McCoy stood empty, silence settled over the snow. Yet within that silence lingered the footsteps of men whose lives had been altered not by battles, but by bandages, scalpels, and syringes. The war had begun with fire, bombs, and declarations of undying loyalty. It ended, for these prisoners, with something far stranger: survival delivered by the very hands they had been taught to hate. Decades later, some of those men would speak cautiously of their time in America. A former sailor admitted that he could still hear the click of surgical instruments in his dreams, the steady breathing of the nurse who had leaned close to check his pulse. Another confessed that each time he saw a child receive a vaccination in post-war Japan, he thought of the American doctor who had once saved him with the same ritual gesture. These memories were not loud proclamations, but quiet truths, carried like hidden talismans. The scars endured, both visible and unseen, a line of stitches across the thigh, a faint puncture mark on the arm, a diary entry written in trembling ink. These became symbols of a war whose contradictions no victory parade could fully resolve. For some, the scars were burdens, reminders of weakness. For others, they were proof of a wider world, evidence that even in war, compassion had refused to vanish entirely. In the end, the story of these prisoners is not one of statistics or logistics alone, but of human fragility. It is about how ideology can fracture in the face of small gestures, a sugar cube, a shared cup of coffee, a stitch placed carefully by an enemy's hand. And perhaps that is the lesson that remains most haunting, that survival itself can be the most radical form of transformation.